Welcome to our Casual Friday. Now, I know that you are busy, but I would like to kindly ask you to intervene on the course forum with respect to the exercises of week 5 because these exercises are very important to continue our discussion on the topics of that week. There are still materials that are supposed to appear on the course platform, but I'm waiting for your interaction. Naturally, we cannot wait until infinity, so if nothing happens, those materials will nevertheless appear next week, in week 7, but they will not be part of the final exam. So we have a first question from Kirill. Kirill asks, how can we modify survival models to make them useful for stress testing? The answer actually is simpler than what you may think. Uh, in particular, when we consider parametric and semi-parametric approaches, we have covariates. Now, the idea is to stress these covariates. What will happen? We will obtain new hazards, new survival functions, and we can collect these results. Then the point will be what to do with these results. We can be very fancy and very statistical and build hierarchical models, or we can be a little bit simpler, for example, by averaging. Now, the problem is that not all covariates are the same. If we consider macroeconomic covariates or economic covariates in general, it is easier to stress test. Why? Because typically we can rely on historical data. So we can build the usual scenarios. And we can also use, for example, Monte Carlo techniques so that we can also input extreme events we have not observed yet. So for this type of covariates, stress testing is not a big deal. Essentially, the burden can be a computational burden, but from a theoretical point of view, no big deal. For what concerns other types of covariates, say for example behavioral covariates, then it can be tough because how can we really have data for stress test these? How can we stress test behavior? And actually this type of covariates is quite used in retail banking when you are dealing with individual choices. In that case, it's not that easy to stress test, but I'm posting extra readings on the course platform for you. On the course forum, Florian noticed that the IRB formula is based on many assumptions, some of which are for sure violated for most portfolios and also in real life. Now, for some of these assumptions in reality, the regulator has already proposed possible solutions. Think, for example, of the assumption of granularity, so granular portfolios, and the correction, which is represented by the granularity adjustment. Now, something less obvious is present for the normality assumption. And this is quite strange because the normality assumption is actually one of the strongest assumptions we are making in order to derive the IRB formula. And that's strange because the academic community has heavily criticized this assumption. Now, in principle, it's not really difficult to drop the assumption of normality. So you remember we have our one-factor copula model that we can represent in different ways, but at the end of the day, we have a factor component and the epsilons. Now, for what concerns the common factor capital V, actually we can assume whatever type of distribution we want, and the general formula will not change. In particular, what is important is that the new distribution we are assuming for V, not a non-normal distribution, will have finite moments. This is very important, so a finite mean and a finite variance, and that these moments can be somehow rescaled so that we obtain a zero mean and a variance which is more or less 1. If these two things can be fulfilled, then we can choose whatever type of distribution for capital V. A little bit more problematic is the choice of the distribution for the epsilons, because in principle, even here, we can choose whatever type of distribution, but we may lose the model itself, because remember that we are building everything on the basis of credit metrics. So in this case we should just focus on normal like distributions, such as for example the T distribution, that nevertheless allows for extreme events depending on the degrees of freedom. Now we can choose these, we can change our distribution, and we can still obtain a formula which is comparable to the IRB formula. So the question is, why don't we do that? Florian then states, you can argue that all banks are required to model risk weights consistently wrong to limit the excessive variability due to model choices. This naturally introduces a huge Basel model risk. Now, this is an extremely good point. While it is understandable that the regulator wants to reduce the risk of very big mistakes in evaluations, from the other side, my personal view is that too many rules, too many constraints are wrong and dangerous for the economy. In principle, I'm in favor of principle-based approaches instead of rule-based approaches, even if with rule-based approaches is much better for my consulting. But what's the point? Variability, this monster we want to fight, actually is something essential for a healthy market, because variability is what punishes bad behaviors and what rewards good behaviors. So banks should be allowed to use the sound modeling. So what is important is that the modeling is sound. The sound modeling they prefer in order to assess risk. Naturally, they also have to take the risk of their choices. This is very important. So it's not that someone else will pay for their bad choices. This is important for a healthy economy. Now, the only limitation I see as essentials are the limitation that intervene when a sound modeling is not available. So an example can be the example of operational risk. At this very moment, not many models are available for operational risk, and we are still struggling even with the definition of operational risk. In this particular situation, it can be a good decision not to use extremely advanced approaches that are not yet tested, that we don't know, and it's better to use more conservative approaches. And this is actually what the Basel Committee is doing by saying that we will essentially remove the AMA, so the advanced measurement approaches, in favor of more standard approaches. If we reduce variability, because we really fear variability, in my view, we are just preparing for the next crisis. Why? Because we are somehow sweeping the dust under the carpet. The point is that if we reduce variability, we are making all the different agents on the market, in our case banks, the same in terms of risk. Now, this can be risky. Why? Because assume that there is some event that can affect one of these agents. If one of these events can affect one agent, since all the agents are more or less the same, this could, in principle, generate a stronger cascading effect on the market. On the contrary, if we have variability, what happens? People know that there is risk, so their behavior is more risk averse. It's a little bit more naturally conservative, and this can be very good for the economy. I typically use a paradox, the Fang's paradox, in order to illustrate this situation. So imagine there is a wonderful canyon, and at the end of this canyon there is a fantastic red river. But in order to see the river, you have to lean out, and the cliff is something like 200 meters high. Now, people are scared of height, so most people, in order to see the river, and when I say most people, I say most of the courageous people, not the not courageous one that obviously don't want to see the river. So those people try to lean out by laying on their stomachs and just peeking down and looking at the river, and then they come back because they know that this is dangerous. Nothing happens, everyone is more or less okay, yeah, a little bit of a scared of the height, but nothing serious happens. Now one day a very bold guy arrives and he does not want to lay on his stomach. He say, it's nothing for me, I can just watch down and see. So he just leans out, but he falls down. So he dies. This is a tragedy, but essentially the guy was having a very dangerous behavior, so somehow nobody was surprised by what happened. Unfortunately, 1 year after, it happened again. So another guy fell down, and after 6 months, another one. So the local government start thinking, okay, but maybe it's really dangerous and we have to intervene, so we have to do something in order not to make people fall down. So they build a fence. Now there is a fence, the situation is safer, and people are a little bit more confident and like to see the river, so they lean out in order to see the river. And also people that before were not really in favor of leaning out are there and they try to look at the river. Unfortunately, nothing is perfect, and one day they discovered that probably the fence is not sufficient because it's not high enough, and kids can easily climb over, so it can be very risky for them. And actually one day one little boy risks to fall down, so the local government intervenes again and builds a very strong fence, larger, taller, very strong one. So now everyone is extremely confident. We have a fence, we are protected. We can finally look at the river and enjoy the sight. And this is what happens. So people really start leaning on the fence in order to see what is below, what is at the end of the canyon, the Red River. A lot of people doing that. Nobody is scared no longer for the height, so they look at the river, and a small crowd of people grows every day looking at the river because now it's safe. But one day a school bus arrives and there are 50 students on top, and they are all very excited by the Red River, so they all come together to the fence together with all the other tourists there, and guess what happens? The fence breaks down and 80 people dies. So was the fence really so safe? So see you next time. Goodbye.